So the purpose of these regenerative finance labs is really to bring us into contact with real world practice. So seeing where things are being created, things that we can participate in, to learn from existing models, to help evolve and create new models of regenerative finance, and preferably at large scales, preferably at the scales of landscapes, territories, bioregions. And when we talk about the Earth Regeneration Fund, then we're talking about planetary network of bioregions. So we move up and down in scales. And today, what I want to share with you is progress that is being made with the Northern Andes Regeneration Fund, which is an explicitly bioregional and regenerative framework that involves currently 7 territories. We started off with 10 territories participating in various ways, and then it's robustly landed with 7 at the end of a 1-year process. And what I want to show to you and share with you is how you can create shared conceptual categories for regenerative work, and then contextual adaptation to the uniqueness of place, and how this is being done with territorial foundations in Colombia. And part of the reason for this being so timely to share about is that the Northern Andes Regeneration Fund is it was officially adopted and born from the movement of territorial foundations in Colombia about a month ago, which is that they had this gathering, the national gathering, Encuentro Nacional is what they call it in Spanish, where they would come together and they discussed the Northern Andes Fund after a year of work, and then agreed that they would adopt it and its governing structures that were created. So basically, we began a process in February of last year to create it, and I'll talk about that process. And what has come out of it that for me is particularly exciting is its scale invariance, or said another way, that it has similar shape, similar patterns at different scales, so that you're able to move between local regenerative initiatives up to the scale of a territory, up to the scale of a network of territories, and see similar patterns of organizing and governance across the different scales, which allows us to create alternative financial flows and alternative ways of creating relationships to really give birth to regenerative economies. And so this is work I'm really excited about, because I've been helping and observing the creation of different kinds of funding ecosystems in the global north, like in North America and in Europe, and there's some really beautiful work being done. But what is happening in Colombia is so coherent and coming together so quickly that it's really, really inspiring. And I think there's something we can all learn from it. So what I want to do is give a presentation that'll take about maybe 25 minutes, maybe 30 minutes. And so we can set a really nice and rich context for our conversation. And then I'd love for us to discuss various things like, what do we do with this? How could you participate in it? How could you learn from it? What are the questions you have about it that I didn't answer? Where are future directions that something like this could go to help us to replicate these kinds of patterns all over the planet? So this is the kind of context that I want to bring to the conversation today. And now I'm going to start the presentation. So let's see here. That's the wrong slide deck. This is the one I want. Here we go. Actually, before I do that, let me minimize that. There we go. All right, so today we're going to be talking about how to create a bioregional funding ecosystem at the large scale with the Northern Andes. And here's a really nice topographic map of basically the northern half of South America, where you can see that the Andes create the Northern Andes create about half of the basin of drainage for the Amazon, for all the Amazon rivers. So many of the Amazon rivers are born in Colombia and Venezuela and Ecuador, and then down into Peru and further south. But in this part of the northern part, the Andes divide into 3 parallel mountain ranges, which we've talked about for the work in Barichara. Today we'll go to a larger scale. But to start exploring how was this fund created, I want to go through a little bit of a review for those of you who are familiar with the work in Barichara, because the approach we took in Barichara is what is being replicated into the other territories. And so I want to start by just orienting us that here's Barichara in that one of the turns, the places where the Northern Andes makes a turn. And as we zoom in, the region that we're working on regenerating for Barichara is actually a holistic climate system embedded within the different mountain ranges of the Northern Andes. And then as you zoom in closer, you see that Barichara, which is right here, is on a plateau that has been almost completely deforested. And so this is a region that is becoming a desert. You know, it's a tropical dry forest, and it's actually the only one of its kind. There are other kinds of tropical dry forest, but this one is the high Andes tropical dry forest with interactions with a cloud forest to the west. And it's highly endemic, which means 8 out of 10 species exist nowhere else on Earth. So it's really catastrophic that more than 95% of the forest has been cut down in the last 80 years for monoculture agriculture, which has caused an extinction event that we haven't even measured. So we don't know how many extinctions occurred here. And it's now in the process of becoming a desert. Basically, the tropical dry forest has an extended dry season and an extended wet season, similar to what you would have in a Mediterranean climate. And in this landscape, we have clay soils on steep slopes. So once you cut off the vegetation by removing the forest, you create the perfect recipe for a very rapid erosion and desertification. This is also the home to the ancestral Guane people and then the indigenous people who came before them. There are amazing archaeological sites in the canyons of this area going back at least 7,000 years. And there are regions nearby that have archaeological evidence going back to 14,000 years. Some of the oldest human artifacts found in the Americas are in this part of the Northern Andes. And so there's a very, very long history of human habitation. And the town of Barichara itself is registered as a national monument in Colombia, which means that they have a lot of support from the Ministry of Culture to preserve and promote local arts and crafts. And so there's a really strong local craft culture in Barichara, which means that we're building an economy, a regenerative economy around the restoration of ecosystems, but grounded in these local craft skills that are so strong here. And that are currently the basis of a major tourism economy that's overall pretty destructive to the territory. And so in Barichara, we have this rich environment, but when you look out at the Northern Andes and look at Colombia in general, Colombia is kind of phenomenal in that it is the 5th most biodiverse country when you're looking at nation state boundaries. Colombia is number 5 in the world for biodiversity. But when you combine cultural diversity with biodiversity, Colombia comes in number 1 very strongly, because there's a huge diversity of indigenous cultures that are still largely intact in this whole region of the Northern Andes. And there's incredible biodiversity. But also historically, major fields of research like biogeography, conservation biology, ethnobotany were actually created in Colombia because of the wealth of knowledge about plants and plant medicine and the incredible diversity of ecosystems. You can literally move 10 kilometers, like up or down the mountains or to the north or the south, and move from one valley to the next and find a completely different ecosystem with completely different biodiversity. So the Northern Andes are phenomenal as a planetary reserve of biodiversity and cultural diversity. And they're also, like I said before, a major shape of the landform for birthing the Amazon basin is in the Northern Andes. So this is a place with truly continental and planetary significance. And so what we have been doing throughout the last 5 years is working toward creating a funding ecosystem in Barichara. And then in parallel with it, there's been a movement of activating territories to create their own territorial governance and sovereignty for economic development. And in that web of activities is how we've been creating this ecosystem for the Northern Andes. So I'm going to give a brief summary here that really focuses more on the Barichara part of it, because the part in Barichara is what gave rise to the patterns that are now being replicated into other territories. So starting in late 2020 and early 2021, we created the Barichara Regeneration Fund. This was anchored to crowdfunding to raise money to buy a piece of land that's now a nature reserve called Oriental. And we had leftover money that we were able to then flow into a tapestry of 15 other regenerative initiatives. And that began a process of weaving territorial patterns for regeneration that was inspired to become bioregional. And during that time, we were invited to participate in a course on community foundations, hosted by what later became an organization called Territoria, but this is before that organization was created. And so we began this journey over the next 3 years until March of 2024, about a year ago, when we legally constituted our own territorial foundation, Fundación Barichara Regenerativa. And when we did this, we started to create different kinds of community funds, which is basically a way of creating thematic clusters for local regenerative initiatives and social actors doing regenerative work, so that we could understand them through different thematic lenses. So we could have a focus on regenerative education or alternative approaches to creating a regenerative economy, the restoration of forest and soil and watershed, and various kinds of healing processes. And as we were building those structures, we were participating continuously in the creation of a movement of territorial foundations, which is now led by an organization called Territoria, and that spans all of the Northern Andes and is partnering with other parts of Latin America. The first territorial foundation ever created was in the early 90s in Mexico. There's a history of them being created in Romania and in Eastern Europe. And now there are new ones forming in Ecuador and Chile and Peru and in Brazil and other parts of Latin America. But the strongest pulse of activity is currently happening in Colombia and has been going on for about 4 years now. So we basically started our process with the Barichara Regeneration Fund just as the first workshop was being offered on territorial foundations in Colombia that then gave birth to this movement. So we were not leading the creation of the movement, but we were there from like step zero, starting it with them. And that means that we could then start to weave the other territories to replicate some of the patterns in Barichara into a Northern Andes Regeneration Fund. And that's the amazing thing that's been happening in the last year. And so to give you a sense of how this is structured at a territorial scale, in Barichara, what we've done is we started, meaning I started, thinking about creating a bioregional learning center. And so I started mapping the different regenerative education initiatives as programs, as site-based work, as ecosystem restoration work, as educational programs, as healing centers, various ways that regenerative education was happening to start creating an ecosystem for bioregional education. And as I was doing that work, we created the Barichara Regeneration Fund. And that led to creating a territorial foundation. Now, why did we need to create this organization? It's because to regenerate an entire bioregion, we have to take the whole system into account, and we needed to identify the patterns of regenerative work that flow across existing projects and initiatives. And then the territorial foundation's job is to mobilize resources and service to this tapestry of regenerative initiatives to create pathways toward integration, because the initiatives were all isolated from each other. And so we created Fundación Barichara Regenerativa. I won't talk a lot about its structure, just a little bit, but I'll say that one of the things this foundation does not do is implement regenerative projects. The Territorial Foundation convenes and does mapping and provides financial support to help create shared agendas for the implementers who are already in the territory. And so it's what's sometimes called a second level organization. In Spanish, they'd say una organización de segundo piso, the second floor, which means that the Territorial Foundation works at a level above the local projects and initiatives to coordinate and convene and facilitate their collaboration with each other. And in order to do this, we identified 5 thematic areas that are not meant to be exclusive of each other, but just to build coherence of focus, so that we could help people understand how they could work together. And so we had a focus for regenerative education to bring all the different work related to regenerative education together, the work on regenerative economy, the work on ecosystem restoration in its diverse forms, the work on creating regenerative culture, like creating frameworks of collaboration and mutual aid and community philanthropy and building trust with each other. And then, of course, a lot of work on territorial healing, decolonization, trauma healing work, and work in building the construction of peace after a history of violence, which is a really big deal in Colombia. So this Territorial Foundation is doing all of this work. And we found that a way that we could organize this so people could understand it, because we're dealing with such holistic systems and so much complexity, was we saw that we could actually structure the Territorial Foundation's actions into different focused thematic areas that have their own funding dynamics, that have their own multi-capital or multi-resource flows that create frameworks of collaboration. So for example, there's an education fund for regenerative education that includes different projects and initiatives that are brought together to collaborate on creating an ecosystem of regenerative education. And there are different projects and initiatives around the restoration of rivers and watersheds, like to create community aqueducts, to do GIS mapping, to coordinate ecological corridors to become connected with each other, that are about restoring our watersheds, that have their own funding structure and collaborative framework. And then there's a different collaborative framework for how we transform local resources, create different kinds of mutual aid and solidarity and exchange with each other. So there's this regenerative economy fund, which is a space for collaborating around different economic models and different cultural aspects of economic exchange. And then we're creating a cultural healing fund, which really looks at the various dimensions of healing in our territory. There's a lot of healing work that happens in Barichara, a lot of peace building work that happens around territorial dialogues for water, territorial dialogues about violence against women, different kinds of trauma healing work, lots of use of arts and theater. And you see that these become containers for coherent collaboration. So it takes incredible complexity and makes it more manageable. But what we understand as a territorial foundation is that we can take those 5 thematic areas we defined before, and we can flow resources across these different frameworks of collaboration. And it creates a coherent way that money could come to the territory. We can convene different stakeholder groups in these different funding circles, and they can create their own collaborative budgets. And then we can mobilize financial resources within and synergies between them as collaborative frameworks. And the Territorial Foundation is holding and convening and coordinating all of this work. And this creates really clear structure for financial flow from the outside to come into the community on the ground. So this is the structure that we replicated into the Northern Andes Fund. And so just to show you a little bit more of how this works with one of the funding structures, to see that there's a really strong linkage between the territory as a whole and the minutiae and the details of local action. So within the Regenerative Education Fund, we have Bioparque Moncora, which is a community reforestation project, Origen del Agua, which is also a reforestation and watershed restoration project. Both of them have various community education activities that are happening. And then we have our alternative regenerative school, Sueños del Bosque. And we went to raise funding for them as a portfolio. But then we started adding other initiatives, like we bought a piece of land called Totumo, which is now becoming a community healing center and a community learning center. Las Ruinas, which will become a place for creating a center for education for young children for the territory as a whole. Tierra Sagrada focuses on bringing land into the commons and creating different kinds of community agreements. And what the Regenerative Education does, the Regenerative Education Fund does, is it takes multiple sites and multiple initiatives and helps to weave them into an ecosystem. So this fund is not really about money, even though money moves into the space. It's really about identifying and valuing the different kinds of resources we have, coming together and learning about each other's projects and initiatives, and collaborating with the potentials that we can manifest from to create new capacities together. And the Regenerative Education Fund catalyzes the dynamic of all of that so that we can create a learning ecosystem for the territory as a whole. And so this way of seeing how local and sometimes very small projects and initiatives are connected to each other as a tapestry through a shared funding environment. And this allows us to work directly with the leaders of those local projects to have them create the agendas and tell us what the priorities are. So when we do bring in funding, it's based on direct practical knowledge from the people doing the work on the ground. So one of the principles of the Northern Andes Fund is the people doing the work on the ground are the experts. They know better than anyone else how to spend the money. And so when you look at this at a landscape scale, you can see that different regenerative initiatives related to education can be in different locations in the territory. So we can actually catalyze activities in different parts of the territory by looking at them as an ecosystem. So it's just another way of thinking about how we bring these different initiatives together. Now, what's powerful about this is we brought this framework to another territorial foundation that's based in the savannah of Bogota called Paisano. And as you can see here, it says Somos la primera fundación territorial en Colombia. They were actually the first territorial foundation to be legally constituted. They constituted in 2022, whereas we constituted in 2024. But we were doing our work and learning alongside them from the very beginning. So in this picture, there's Carolina and Kelly, the two amazing women that started Paisano, and they're doing incredible work in Bogota. And when we started talking about creating a Northern Andes Regenerative Fund, they identified that the major watershed of the Bogota River and its tributaries creates a framework for them to coordinate a lot of what they're doing. And so what they did with Paisano is they replicated some of the structures in Barichara. Now, their categories aren't identical, but they're very similar. They have a category for regenerative economy, a category for regenerative agriculture, a category for regenerative education and culture, and a category for regenerative territories, which for them is geographic areas for like a major agricultural zone, a landscape development framework, or a watershed that they're organizing within. And then they have their own different community funding structures. They had about 15, and they chose 5 of them to start prototyping within the Northern Andes Fund. So as we bring money into the Northern Andes Fund, some of it comes to Paisano, and they organize it thematically by these 4 themes on the left, and then allocate it by the priorities of the different community funds based on the priorities of these thematic areas. So they have identified within their own multi-stakeholder process, they've done their own community engagement, that within regenerative economy, they have specific priorities this year. So if money from the outside comes in, they know which community funds to flow the money to that are priorities based on that action happening on the ground. And you can see that this is a perfect mirror of the logic that happened in Barichara's ecosystem of funding. They just changed their structures very slightly. And so what we found was that by creating the structure in Barichara, helping Paisano to imitate our structure and adapt it and change it to their local context, that we had a framework that could then be replicated to other areas. Because you see, Bogota and the savanna of Bogota and the high plains of the Northern Andes is very different. The culture is very different. The diverse cultures are very different. The ecosystems are very different. They have a 14 million person population city, which we don't have where we are. So there are a lot of differences, but the framework of regenerative themes, community funds, and flowing funding into these networks of action is the same framework, which means that we can look at these very different contexts, but have a shared approach. And so what we did to create the Northern Andes Fund was we worked with all of the territories that have already either legally created their territorial foundation or have made the decision as a local organizing team that they are going to create a territorial foundation so that we could create governance around 2 levels of membership. Those who have voting rights within the fund who are legally constituted, and those who have an advisory role but no vote, which is those who are wanting to legally constitute but have not done so. Notice that this gives them the incentive to continue the process and constitute their own foundations so that they can have a vote in the fund later on. And so we've been helping build coherence across these different territories with the Northern Andes Fund. And so the way that it happened is, just like I said, Barichara Regenerativa and Paisano, the 2 most mature and most advanced territorial foundations doing regenerative work, created a shared framework, created administrative and monitoring systems, or at least began to create them as a shared framework, where each of them has their own monitoring system, but they have shared frameworks between their monitoring systems. And then they brought in other territories. Sembrando Paz, which is in Montes de Maria, which is up on the Caribbean coast and is another tropical dry forest. Agua Vida y Paz, which is in Florencia, which is a sacred headwaters of the Northern Andes in the southeastern part of Colombia. Then Putumayo Florece, which is in the Sibundoy Valley, which is another sacred headwater of the Amazon rainforest that's down in the southeastern part of Colombia. Then there's Funimos in Abura Valley, which is near Antioquia, an area with really powerful waterfalls and tropical rainforests and cloud forests. And then there's the Cauca Valley near Cali, and with an organization called Creamos. Creamos, which is Creamos is the word we create together, and Amos is we love. So they put the names We Create Love together in the name of their foundation. And in these 7 organizations, these 7 territorial foundations, we're creating shared frameworks of bioregional regeneration, inspired by the work in Barichara and now the work in Paisano. And we're starting to create tracking systems for how funding can flow to the priorities of these local actors organized as community funding collaboratives, which means they have shared budgets for their funding agendas embedded within larger regenerative themes. And that way of mapping and flowing resources and coordinating governance is what the Northern Andes Fund has been creating. So how does this work in a sort of conceptual sense is like this? We invite money or other resources and support to come into the Northern Andes Regeneration Fund. Then we distribute those resources across a network of territorial foundations, and the territorial foundations are organized as watersheds and as holistic hydrological systems. They have their high watershed level areas, their low watershed levels. They're organized with rivers and valleys and with ecological corridors. And then because of this local structure that the territories are organizing within their own landscapes, the funding can arrive into local action networks, which is networks of regenerative initiatives that already have trust built with their local territorial foundations to be able to implement actions that they want to take with the funding that arrives. And then that, of course, creates a lot of activity so those stories can be shared back out into the world. For those of you who are familiar with the Earth Regeneration Fund, this is exactly the same model, is that we bring funding into the Earth Regeneration Fund, distribute it to bioregional funding ecosystems around the world. They bring the money to local action on the ground through their different ways of locally organizing. And then they tell their stories back to the world, which invites more resources and support to the Earth Regeneration Fund. That logic is exactly imitated in the Northern Andes Fund. So you could imagine a Great Lakes Fund being structured in this way. You could imagine a Salish Sea Fund or a Cascadia Fund being structured in this way. You could imagine the rivers of the North Sea being structured in this way. The Mediterranean could be structured in this way, and so on. The key thing behind all of this that I should mention is that there is a support organization. This is not a territorial foundation. They're a regular Colombian foundation called Territoria. And what they have done is they have been the organization that supports the movement of territorial foundations, that hosts the national gatherings, that help to support and convene the gatherings of exchange between different bioregions, and they are the administrative host. So if you go to their website, you can see this Fondo Bioregional de Regeneración Norteandino, this Northern Andean Bioregional Regeneration Fund, and learn more about how its 2 guiding structures are that it's about regeneration and it's structured bioregionally, and it's got all of the different elements that I've just described. And so without Territoria, it wouldn't have been possible to create this fund or to continue the work of it. So now I just want to briefly tell the story of how the fund came into being and what its current status is. So you can see that this isn't just theory, this is something happening in practice. So a year ago, in basically February of 2024, there was the National Gathering of Territorial Foundations that took place in Putumayo. Putumayo, as I mentioned, is one of the sacred headwaters of the Amazon in the southeastern part of Colombia, fairly close to the border of Ecuador. And so we were in Putumayo, and we were talking about how do we sustain the leadership and the financial supports for the different territorial foundations as a movement. And while we were there in one of the breakout groups, I said, why don't we create a Northern Andes Regeneration Fund? What do you think of that? And then our breakout group took that back to everyone that was at the gathering. And guess what? Everyone loved the idea. They loved the idea so much that about a month later, a few of us, a smaller group of us, from Paisano, from Territoria, and from Barichara Regenerativa, we gathered in Bogota to have a strategy meeting. And in that meeting, we outlined the design principles of the Northern Andes Regeneration Fund. I then took the story of that to a funder and was able to attract a $150,000 gift from a foundation that supported the rest of the work. That allowed us to do two things. One is it allowed us to do the work I'm about to describe of creating the fund, and it also allowed us to give some of the funding to the territories that are the most advanced to practice. So there was money that went to Barichara to practice its administration of funds. There was money that went to Paisano to practice its administration of funds. And there was money set aside for the foundation in Putumayo, but for various reasons, they weren't able to start practicing, and that money went back into the fund to do other things. And that's why Barichara Regenerativa and Paisano ended up prototyping this shared monitoring and administration system. But what happened that was so powerful was the way that we facilitated, or the way that Territoria facilitated, a 6-month process of monthly workshops. These were online, they were Zoom calls. Once a month, a 3-hour meeting. We had an amazing team of leaders from Paisano and Barichara Regenerativa and Territoria that collaboratively, using Miro boards like world experts, to facilitate an incredible design process that mapped out almost 300 regenerative initiatives in 7 territories, and that created the governing structure that was adopted at the end of the year. And that meant that when the next year of territorial foundations met in the headwaters of the Bogota River, which happened in the first week of March, so just a couple weeks ago, that they actually formally adopted the Northern Andes Regeneration Fund and its governing structure. So the Territorial Foundation movement adopted it, and it was officially born. And I just want to go through 3 elements of what was created. So this is from a report that was created in English to give to the funder that provided the $150,000 seed funding, which was that there were 5 collective construction workshops where they basically hosted participatory design processes so that they could answer the fund's main questions. What are its principles and values? What is its thematic North Star? Do we have a shared understanding of what it means to be bioregional? What is our strategy for managing resources in the fund and passing it through to the territories? And how do we create a monitoring and learning system across the 7 territories? This enabled the 6 sessions that I mentioned, these 6 workshops of co-creation, where we used the experience of Paisano and Barichara Regenerativa to create the operational axes, which was those thematic funding themes, those themes of regenerative economy, of ecosystem restoration, of regenerative education, and so on, and what the governing structures were in terms of who has rights to vote and to participate, who has the right to receive money, what are the responsibilities in governing the fund. Several different work groups were created as an operational structure. And then at this meeting that happened earlier this month, this face-to-face meeting happened where they shared all of this, and it was all formally adopted. And so all of this happened in the last year, which is pretty incredible. And we will know next week we're either going to receive another $150,000 from the same donor, or if they approve it, we're waiting for board approval, we may get $350,000 for the Northern Andes Fund for the next year. Stay tuned, we'll know next week after their board meeting, which means that this fund is continuing either way, but it might continue with a lot more power starting next month. And so basically what's happened is this: we have these 7 territorial foundations that either are already formed or in the process of forming, but we have cultivated through those workshops a shared understanding of bioregional regeneration, and we have created a monitoring system for all of the diverse local efforts, which is we asked each territorial foundation to map their own regenerative initiatives. And when we did that, these 4 major themes came up: ecosystem restoration, territorial healing, regenerative economies, and regenerative education. And within those 4 major themes, we collectively identified 284 regenerative initiatives that were in the 7 different territories. And so that means that we can now create budgets for millions of dollars and say, look, we need lots of money because there's so many initiatives and there's so much work to do. And you can trust us with that money because we can receive large amounts of money, distribute it to the 7 territorial foundations. They can distribute it to their own community funds, and then those community funds can distribute it to their own local initiatives. All of it with transparency and accountability because of the monitoring systems that are being created. It's pretty freaking amazing. And so what's beautiful about this is Colombia is already organized bioregionally. If you look here on the right, these are the departments or the administrative units, the versions of provinces or states, which correspond with the watersheds because of the incredibly rough and intense topography of the Northern Andes. And we're using that to take this larger idea that if continents organize as watersheds, we can organize with the territories of Colombia that are also organized as watersheds. And then we can focus on creating systems of education, economy, ecosystem restoration, and land use change by using the organizing patterns of watersheds. And that this is now being implemented across the Northern Andes through this funding structure. And I want to close the presentation part to be able to open us into a discussion about a huge error made by the conquistadors, the colonizers 500 years ago. Because the conquistadors came looking for the myth of El Dorado gold. There was this observer who saw a shaman go out on a lake with a boat full of gold and dump the gold into the lake without any understanding of the spiritual significance of gold in the Northern Andes. And so then there was this bloodthirst, this bloodlust of raping and pillaging and killing and stealing that gave birth to the colonization of the Americas as they came to try and steal all of the gold from Colombia. And that's why Colombia is named after Cristobal Columbus. But what they failed to see is that Colombia's true wealth is not gold. It's her abundant and diverse natural ecosystems and the incredible diversity of human cultures. And that's what we are, in a sense, capitalizing on. We're building regenerative economies on the foundation of biodiversity as wealth and of cultural ecological knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge as wealth. And we're building regenerative economies to decolonize the Northern Andes and to undo 500 years of conquistadors. And so, I don't know, what do you think of all that? What does that bring up for you? What do you feel? Do you have questions? Like I said, the truly amazing thing is the leadership of these local groups, what they are doing in their own territories. But I'd love to open it up to questions and comments. If you just want to raise your hand, what does this bring up for you? Are there things I didn't make clear enough about how it works? You can see it's still being constructed, so I'm sure it's going to change. Steve, over to you.
Yeah. Thank you, Joe. So inspiring to see the coherence emerging at multiple scales, and especially to see what was beginning to look like a repeatable pattern that you've been able to replicate and adopt. I have lots of questions. I put some of them in the chat, but they relate to basically, coming from my perspective, just trying to understand the information requirements, the information system requirements that, if addressed, what could reduce barriers, help with shareability, help with data sovereignty, whatever the requirements are. But that I'd be very keen to understand those at some depth, more depth than you can get into here also, of course. But if you have like the actual documents that express those 284 initiatives, that'd be super useful to see what did they decide was salient information to capture those. You mentioned the design principles that you outlined. What were those design principles? You mentioned the operational agreements that emerged from those 6 collaborative governance sessions. Can we get copies of those? That's a treasure trove of information. My hope here, and you anticipated my first question, which is, we always have to be sensitive to the regenerative mindset, in my view, is hyper local, right? It starts at a hyperlocal scale, right? And so anytime we try to impose some sort of shared framework, there's the whole colonial tendency to come in and literally impose it, right? So much more challenging, but much, much more important is to discover these emergent patterns. And if different groups, hyperlocal, sovereign, autonomous groups, can find they resonate with those patterns and can reach agreement about those patterns, now we have frameworks that are truly reusable, right? Without imposing, because they're attractors, right? And so then if we can, if to the extent that those things start to emerge, if we can support those with documented practices and information systems that serve what's emerging there, I just think it could be an amplifier that could accelerate the movement.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. I'll start by saying there is an 18-page document in English that was written in Spanish and then translated to give to the funder. The funder didn't ask for any reporting, but it's like, this might be helpful when we talk to our board for them to understand what we're doing, because they already approved more funding. This is whether they're going to make it a larger amount. And so I have that document. When I share this recording, I'll share that document so that you'll have, and that doesn't go into all of the 284 initiatives. That database is still sort of being shaped to identify indicators. How can indicators be created from the patterns that are being seen? So that's not in a place where it's ready to be shared. So that level of minutia I can't share, but the level of the design principles, the thematic focus, what those different thematic categories mean in terms of what the funding group determined it to mean, I can share a document about that. And then just a comment about the other part you were saying about it being homegrown and not imposed, that I would say that the deepest pattern of learning in this was that almost no one in the Territorial Foundation movement in the beginning knew what regeneration was when we said the word regeneration. They knew what regeneration was in other ways, just they didn't have that word. The word regeneration was, it's like 4 years ago. Like the word regeneration was not in very wide use yet in Colombia. You'd find pockets of it, but most people didn't understand what it was. So part of what was happening was people were looking at what we were doing in Barichara, wondering like, how are they able to raise so much more money? And it was because I was out creating earth regenerators and talking about regeneration, and I was bringing in all these resources. And people were looking at it like, what is that doing? And then gradually we had these really like specific conversations that would come up. Like, would putting solar panels on buildings in Bogota, would that be regenerative or not? And then I'd have to answer and say, well, it depends. Are you perpetuating a machine metaphor and turning the city into a battery to increase consumption of energy and further destroy our material foundations of global civilization? Then hell no, it's not regenerative. But if it's part of a transition pathway to an ecological metaphor and biomimicry for urban development, then it is. And you'll see that kind of nuance requires conversations and trust. And so we had lots of conversations like that until a lot of people came to understand that regeneration includes humans, because people kept saying, oh, but this is environmentalism, and we're talking about helping nursing mothers with, I'm like, dude, that's regenerative too. Humans are animals. We're a subset of biology. And it was like, we would navigate that moment by moment. And so I think the deepest foundation of shared culture was coming to understanding what regeneration means. And then they saw it all around them, because there's a ton of regenerative stuff happening in Colombia. Like so much of it, you're tripping over it all the time. But people didn't have the shared language of regeneration within the movement of territorial foundations. But as that became more coherent, then it was really easy to say, what happens if we organize with watersheds? Like, oh, well, all the indigenous people in our community already told us to do that. It was like, it was actually very natural to then start to weave at a much deeper level. So just to say that homegrown aspect was quite natural because of how much indigenous culture is pervasive in local places across Colombia. That once we had a shared language for some basic concepts, like what is regeneration, it was really easy to say, well, they don't use the word bioregion, but we're using the word territory or landscape, and then we were fine. Like those navigations were really easy to do. Yeah. But it was only because
and then the emergence of the thematic areas like regenerative education, regenerative economy, restoration, cultural regeneration. Has there been a similar sort of convergence, a realization, or agreement on shared terminology in the
Yes,
themes? Okay.
because those thematic categories came out of the practice of trying to organize at a
Yeah.
territorial scale.
Yeah.
And you start to find these are the transversal themes.
Yeah.
Like, what isn't regenerative education when you're doing regeneration? Education's pervasive, right? And you have to get all kinds of alternative economic models to make education work. And so you ended up finding that these were transversal themes, but that they were human understandable. In
Yeah.
the community, people are like, oh, I know what education. Yeah, we're doing education.
Yeah.
And so that was the
Yeah.
touch point that made it work for people.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Way more to say, and
Yeah.
people have been patiently waiting.
Other people have their hands up. So.
Thanks for letting us riff there for a moment. Eric, over to you.
Yes, thank you. I have to say, I've been through these type of processes, but in the finance world. And what's happened over the last couple of years, 3 years, whatever it is just absolutely phenomenal. And to be able to achieve that, and with the coherence and the structure, it is phenomenal. My work comes from the other side, to bring funding at scale, to such a structure as you have created. How do we bridge the language and the practices of the, let's call it, the traditional finance world with the regenerative finance world and all the structures that are surrounding that? So to do that, you basically have to you have to come from that world to understand how to game that world. So that's what I'm doing is so I've created structures which ultimately is designed to attract institutional funding, as in bond funding, long-term project funding, and do it in such a way that it is true to, for lack of a better description right now, true to regenerative finance, community building, local wealth creation, and so on and so on. So I certainly see some touch points along the way there, and but again, phenomenal work. Congratulations.
Well, thank you, Eric. One quick comment on this is something that I learned from permaculture practice is that you don't try to extract, like, say, agricultural production when the soils have been degraded. You have to build the soils first. And so one of the questions is, when is it appropriate for there to be a financial return? And in really degraded systems, financial return is not appropriate until later, because
I agree.
the systems are so degraded. And that's one of the challenges we have, is that a lot of the financial world is geared toward those later stages. So the stuff you're talking about, institutional investment is critical, because that's where the public goods infrastructure is going to be built.
Yes, I fully agree. And there are no valuation models, as in financial evaluation models out there yet, that can evaluate the return in a multi-capital fashion. And that is what is required. So if there's certain things that needs to be put in place. Just one example, institutional investors, if they buy bonds, they are subject to the ups and downs and the speculative trends in the market. Now, there's something that is called mark to model. And mark to model means that you are modeling a 20-year scenario for rebuilding a ecosystem, a bioregion. And it's not an exact science, but you are at the end of each year, when they want to show their profits and show their investors how great fund managers they are and all that kind of stuff, as long as you have been progressing with your plan, they can you satisfy their requirements. As far as the return is concerned as well, that can also be dealt with if you are distinguishing between a cash return and a book return. And there are many different ways of providing them with a book return over a long period of time. So there are ways of actually satisfying the return requirement. It's a long discussion, but that is certainly possible.
Yeah, and then there's common land has their 4 returns as a way of talking, where you have financial return, you have social return, you have ecological return, and you have return on inspiration, which turns out to be the really powerful one. So yeah, I think it's really important for us to bridge these, and as you said, at scale, because we need large scale funding for these kinds of systems.
And the common land model is one. And if you actually really go into the detail of the valuation model and how they justify their projects, it is still predominantly finance-based. Internal rate of return, net present value, and that's partially, I believe, why they struggle to attract serious capital. Anyway, let's give others a chance. There's lots that can be said, but
yeah, thank you, Eric, and to be continued, please. Definitely want to talk more about this. Kelsey, over to you.
Yeah, so I have a question about if there are templates that have been created or are in the creation process for like what you said, kind of creating like a standardized process across these 7 territorial foundations. Like, are there any templates that are available for plug and play in new bioregions that are now in the process of mapping out projects and kind of doing the project management? That's where we're at right now, is mapping the projects, and we have lots of data, but now we're in the process of creating the structures. But my question is, if there's already a structure that we plug the data into.
The answer I would give is yes, and it's still being developed. And what I mean by that is that part of the process of helping the other territories to learn how to organize themselves in terms of regeneration was, we had a workshop on what is a bioregion, and do you understand what a bioregion is? What does that word mean to you? How do you understand what your bioregion is? And what this did is it started to create a shared set of questions. And that's when we arrived at what does it mean to be a regenerative organization? And what happened there was we taught the Carol Sanford approach. So it's like, there were all these, and Theory U was brought in, and some of the other ideas that some of us here are familiar with. And it started to create a shared framework, which becomes a template later, by what did we agree were the coherent patterns that we could organize around. And so when we came up with those 4 thematic areas for regeneration, they become a template. Because if you looked at a document that has those 4 thematic areas, the document actually has bullet points. So it'll say, what do we mean by regenerative education? Well, here are 3 or 4 examples of what we mean. And then when you're looking in your own community, you're going to say, oh, well, I see that we could actually organize some of our data with these bullet points as categories. So once you translate from a table in a Word document to like a spreadsheet in Excel, that kind of a transition, where you go from here are subject headings to here's a list of data organized in tables and columns, rows and columns. That once you've done that, you've actually created a potential monitoring system, because now you can track changes in each of those entries. And so by creating the thematic areas as a way of organizing and then translating them into an administrative system, which is spreadsheets, we're actually templating how you do tracking and monitoring. And that becomes something that then, the way that we're templating it now is started with Barichara and then to Paisano. But now with Barichara and Paisano, we're helping the other 5 territories do it. But as we're helping them do it, we're so-called templating the curriculum, right? We're figuring out how to teach them how to do it. And as we figure out how to teach them how to do it, we're templating it further as education materials. And what I see as the next step from that is to now share that out to the world. So one of the things I'm starting to talk with our team in Barichara and with Territoria about is some of these leaders are really good at English. So it's like, could you teach this to people in Europe? Could you teach this to people in North America? Could we actually come together and talk about what you're doing? And the answer is yes. So I think in the next year, just as one other little piece of this before we go on to Claire, is one of the underlying elements of this is geographic information systems. Is that if we can create standardized ways of layering data geospatially, then those indicators in our spreadsheets become indicators in our ecological design for a watershed restoration. And so what we're doing in Barichara is creating a geospatial reference system to be the basis of our bioregional learning ecosystem. It's like our bioregional learning ecosystem is organized with geospatial data. Now we organize in other ways too, but we want to be sure it's consistent with geospatial data. As we're doing that, we're connecting it with creating a monitoring and an administration system. That's what the money from the Northern Andes Fund for Barichara is funding our admin team and our GIS team to build that, but we're building it as a prototype to template to the other territories. So you see, this is the sort of learning feedback. Whereas in Bogota, they're looking at much more social system mapping, which they're doing more emphasis on that than we are in Barichara because of Bogota's very complex social dynamics, that they're prototyping and templating some of the social system mapping in ways that are more powerful than ours. And when you get to something like Florencia or Putumayo, they're going to have much stronger indigenous participatory patterns than we would have, right? And so we're going to end up with other templating that's going to come into being. So that's just say that learning process is there, and some of the templating exists in just the way we're structuring things. And so as I share some documentation, you'll start to, like, if you squint your eyes, you'll see it, even if it's not in template form. Yeah, like we could make templates from it easily. Now, is there something you want to say, Kelsey? No? Okay. That's such a good question. Claire, over to you.
Yeah, it's really great to hear more. I've been so looking forward to more detail as you're developing it. And I've got two separate questions. One is like really at a very granular detail piece, which is, so I can understand in Barichara, as you're looking at one of the portfolios and knowing the different projects, the people, it's a small, like there's people would probably know what those projects were and have some sense of, you know, the people involved, the trust, the flows that are happening there, and how they actually make sense in the landscape. In a place like Bogota, which is way more spread out, it's quite possible that people won't know the projects. Maybe they do. I don't know. But I'm just wondering how, what that conversation looks like, how that, how do you prioritize as a group? Like, what does that look like? So that's one question. I just wouldn't mind asking the other question, and it's way more macro. And that is, as you start to, so this kind of references back to what was going on in the design school, that post that you put on LinkedIn and with BlackRock and these predatory, financial groups starting to fund regenerative projects I think one of the big concerns is that as soon as you start to get organized, it's like, what are the telltale signs that start making it sort of put a target on the landscapes that are starting to get organized for regeneration that maybe makes for, land, basically buying up the land. They've got the capital to do that. And they know that this is getting organized enough to actually start to bring financial flows back in even before. So it's just, how are we transparent and accountable and sharing the stories, and at the same time protecting ourselves? That's just the question. It's like, what are the considerations? So sorry, those are two kind of separate questions, but I wanted to put them both on the table.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. Those are both really good questions. And I would start by saying the thing that the two questions share is the principle of subsidiarity. the idea that you want to keep governance as close to the action as possible and not go any further away from it than you need to. And so there are two ways that I would think about this initially. One is that these are holonic or whole part kinds of systems. So you can have a coherent framework for a larger whole and then prototype it as a part. So as an example is you could create a small watershed, create a governing framework, and then replicate it into other small watersheds to eventually create a holonic structure for a larger branching watershed system, right? For like a larger basin. And so in that way, the subsidiarity is that you've built sovereign governance that's localized. Even if there are larger structures that play intermediary roles, you keep it as close to the ground as you can. And so you can see how that plays into the question of how do you do the concrete organizing, is you basically take a whole, you have a narrative of a larger whole, but you organize in a part. This morning, I was on a call with John Gasco about what's happening in Dallas, Texas. They're just getting started, like week 1. They're just getting started. And they're already talking about the Trinity River and then picking one of the watersheds to start organizing it. Because the Trinity River in Texas is really big. And so that's an example of what I'm talking about, is they realize they can't start with the big system, but they can start with a story of the big system and then focus on a part of it. So you can think like the Salish Sea, pick one of your watersheds, just as an example of that principle. Or Vancouver Island, which is huge, same idea. And then related to the second question, the really key thing here is how do you structure the incentives from the very beginning? And it turns out a big part of how you structure the incentives is something we talked about on the 4th day of the Bodhicitta immersion when we were in Kaneko Libri. Remember how they were showing the voices of the campesinos that no one was telling, the stories that weren't being told? They went and talked about Don Pacho being displaced from his land in this horrifically unjust way, and no one even knew the story. And then as filmmakers, they went and told Don Pacho's story. That a big part of creating the right incentive structures is creating fully grassroots storytelling. Grassroots talking to the grassroots locally, so that the incentives become aligned with what people are sharing as knowledge about what's happening in their place. And then you start to build the incentive structures around the real necessities, the real pain and struggle of the people that are in the place, rather than doing it from some like, these billionaires created a foundation. They hired a professional group of philanthropy design people to create programs and then set conditions for you to apply for funding. And none of those criteria came from the grassroots. And then you as a grassroots organizer have to beg for money by applying alongside 500 other applicants to try and get that money. And then they're going to put all these burdens on you. We need to reverse that completely, which is you go to the ground and you start having conversations on the ground. And then from the ground, you find people who are allies to what's happening on the ground, and you bring small amounts of financial flow to support them. And you support them to build their capacity to live into a different story and tell that story. And then as they do that, they begin to organize to a larger scale, thematically or geospatially, or both. And meanwhile, with the bioregional frameworks, you have holistic narratives and holistic organizing patterns to hold that process. So it doesn't just spin off into nothing. It doesn't spin off into a bunch of like social justice of displaced people, but it never becomes holistic. Because you need these bioregional frameworks to have that very important social displacement for affordable housing embedded within a bioregional conversation. And so the bioregional frameworks are huge in this because they create the boundaries of the incentive structures. The boundaries are what is holistically healthy. Otherwise, you could end up with some really pathological solutions to a reductionistic part of the system. And so you can see I'm hinting at a lot more needs to be talked about here. I'm not telling the whole story, but this emphasis on it's by, of, and for the grassroots is fundamental for this to work. But luckily, most of your grassroots leaders are grassroots people, or they're working very closely with grassroots people. And so that feedback loop is really tight.
One of the things that is coming up for me though is I know where we are, that like the kind of incentives that are within and the how easy it is to just basically purchase land as corporations, like number companies. Like there's, when you've got huge resources and you've got your local population actually unable to compete, especially when they're paying even over asking prices for these, it's basically driving the price up, pushing the local people out. And so there's actually, it feels to me like whatever grassroots organizing we can do, if the policies don't, if there isn't something that's actually more in a legislative capacity, that we're it's just too much. Like the onslaught is so huge right now. So it's like, okay, so what can we do to control the erosion that's happening? And yeah, so I'm just sort of also thinking there's something in terms of the advocacy and the education of the policymakers that's also required, because it's everything, but that just feels particularly like imperative right now, just because the escalation of it is so huge. And especially with this news about like the trillion-dollar companies. I mean, can you imagine like trillion-dollar companies? There's like, what do you do against that? We really do need to be thinking really large in terms of how to deal with.
The key is to bring the sacred in, because the main reason that is possible is because people sell their land for money. But people don't sell their daughters into prostitution, or hopefully, right? Because their daughters are actually sacred. And there's a direct correlation between controlling the full fertility of land and patriarchy. So that's actually a very direct linkage in the logic. But like the reason people with money can buy land is because people are selling land because the land isn't sacred. It's just a commodity. So you can see the deep work is in that space. And one of the elements of this that I think is really huge is what's happening right now with the Greenpeace legislation, or the Greenpeace fines, where they're charging $660 million to Greenpeace for, very modestly supporting the Sioux Nation and the Standing Rock ceremonies. That basically our legal systems are completely captured in the opposite direction. Right now, like in the United States, the legal system says, I will pay you to rape your daughter. And you're like, what? Like, it's so far from sacred that it's completely offensive. It's like so offensive, you almost can't believe it's happening. And what we need is to go completely the other direction. Land is so sacred, it should never be commodified. And land is in the commons. And so we have to start with the purity of that principle in the cultural education process, even if it takes a while to get there. And the problem with reacting and protesting and fighting, which is necessary in some cases, so I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but that doesn't manage to build that sacred unless that protesting and defending is coming from an already shared sense of the sacred. Like the indigenous land defenders are already coming from a place of the sacred. So they're teaching the sacred in their activism. But it's because they already had the sense of the sacred. So I would just, bludgeon that point over and over again, because it's so damn important. The land is sacred. And if people weren't selling the land, then people couldn't come in and buy it. I mean, obviously militaries can come in and shoot you to take your land, and that certainly has happened and continues to happen. But being forced to do that reveals the true intentions of what happens on sacred land. So it's a huge conversation topic and very important. Thank you, Claire. And Eric, thanks for your patience. Over to you.
No, that's fine. I want to just respond to the BlackRock situation and similar ones. And everything that's been said today, up to now, I fully agree with in terms of your local organization, how you link the people together. The sacred is hugely important. I agree. The reality is, however, we are still in a colonial environment and legal system and what have you. And if you know what you're doing, you can again game the system and inoculate yourself against takeover. But then you have to know what you're doing. Just as and what's in an agreement, excuse me, what's in an agreement is not necessarily how it really works. So, you know, if you can read an agreement and on black and white it says X has has these rights and Y has those rights, and when the chips are down, then Y's rights actually means bugger all. So, just as an example, I was the founder of and took a company public on the Toronto Stock Exchange. And eventually I did a management buyout funded by a private equity fund. And I was chairman of the board. I had the majority of the control. I mean, I had control of the board. My funder was also on the board, and he had debt instruments against the company. So whenever there was a major decision that went the way that the funder did not want, the rest of the board kowtowed because if they didn't, then the debt instrument will be called and on and on and on. So but there are all kinds of mechanisms. You know, Claire, if you've actually created something within your bioregion, if you actually, as you create a project, create the project in such a manner that you can defend yourself, that you cannot be attacked legally, and that's a whole game in its own right. So I mean, it's I don't know who it said, but every revolution, which is bioregionalism, call it a revolution, okay, generates its own counter-revolution. So be prepared for the counter-revolution that is going to come. It will come. As soon as you create something that actually has value, money will come. And at that time, you have to be in a position to raise your middle finger and say, thank you, but no thank you. So, and the last comment is, be very, very careful whose money you take. That's anyway, thank you.
That's very, very powerful advice. Thank you, Eric. I think it's especially the last thing you said about be careful whose money you take. I was the victim of a manipulative and intentional psychopath stealing the most strategic land from the territory in Barichara. And I have learned my lesson.
Yes, no,
about
I'm
that.
aware of that incident.
And one of the things that I'm finding to be really powerful is the exploration of reciprocity. Someone coming with money or any other kind of value, how do you go about creating reciprocity? And recognizing that reciprocity is active construction. You actively construct it. So there's this intentionality. And I think that's where these mechanisms of defense and protection you're describing are extremely important. Extremely important.
No,
so yeah,
you cannot go without, and then that's why within what I've done is it is a long-term project. You cannot cherry pick which piece of the project you want. If you, Mr. Funder, if you're coming in day one, you can leave day 365 of year 20. That's it. If you're in, you're in. There is value, but the value stays within the community, within the region. It is not, you've given me money and then you want to suck it all out. So if you, yes, we can do all the bookkeeping, accounting, profit charging, you know, you want, but you are not extracting. So, and if you're not prepared to do that, thank you, goodbye. So there are many ways of doing it. Anyway.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. I think it's the question that Claire just put into the chat. How do you create regenerative relationships rather than extractive relationships? Which I would say is a good question for love, economics, and war. If you want to put it out, like it's just a good question for all relationships. Is another way of saying it. Like we should develop healthy reciprocity in all of our relationships. So I guess my question now is, first of all, are there any other questions or comments about the fund or about what we've discussed, anything we've discussed? Lots of rich topics have come up here.
I would just add just one,
Yeah.
what I work with and talk about is fair exchange as opposed to profit. And fair exchange is actually an energetic exchange. And if you, and I'm not going to go into the details, but energy can be measured. The energy can be felt, and so it's a way of having a conversation that is deflecting the profit and the what's my dividend and what's my return and all that kind of stuff. And there are funders, substantial funders out there that actually understand that language, but they just don't know really how to participate in sort of the, for example, the fund that you've just explained to us all so beautifully. So
what I would love to do is to walk the path of meeting those people and talking with them and learning how we can help them to see the value of this with what's going on at the state of the world. Because one of the things that I'm seeing right now is there is a lot of intentional posturing and positioning within the regenerative space to receive funding that creates distortion with what's actually happening on the ground. Whereas what's needed is really clear narrative pathways to connect people who want to resource these kinds of activities to be able to connect and work with the people who are actually doing it, and have intermediary support and advising and wisdom to help guide those relationships coming into being. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done in that space. And what I would say about where the Northern Andes Fund is right now is we're doing it. And what I mean is, when I say we're doing it, I mean the territorial foundations of Colombia, of which I'm a part, are doing it. And so as more funding comes in for the second year, and one of the things we talked about in increasing the budget, if it's approved, is to actually give money to the groups that are the least developed in creating their foundations to help them to become coherent and start to move toward territorial governance so that they can then participate in the fund. So one of the big things that we observed in the first year that I didn't talk about earlier was the lack of replaceable leadership in facilitating the fund. As we created the fund, we had 4 key people who were facilitating those workshops. One of them, Natalia Ortiz, who's part of our group in Barichara, her mother died. Suddenly, her mother died. And then she spent a month away, and the whole process collapsed because there was no way to replace Natalia. I mean, if you've met Natalia, she's kind of irreplaceable anyway. She's an exceptional human being. But what we learned from that was we needed to have additional funding to help people to assist the facilitation, to learn to be facilitators, to be able to replace facilitators when needed. The other big lesson we learned was that some of the foundations that were early in their formation process could not participate in the workshops because they were financially impoverished and they had to work other jobs. And we actually needed to provide stipends for them to participate. And we didn't have budget for that in the beginning, but now we know, as we have new funding coming in, that's a priority. We have to give stipends for participation from the territories that have less financial resources. And so these were like very powerful process lessons that we could only learn in practice. We might have anticipated them, but really it was the practice that revealed them. And now we know in the next round, there's process improvements. And so just saying that this work is definitely alive and real. And so you'll have ways to participate in it by connecting with the people that are leading the work in the movement of territorial foundations. And the main barrier is language for those who don't speak Spanish. But some of the key leaders are completely fluent in English, and some of them in other languages as well. So there are pathways where we can start to bridge this more actively, and I think it needs to happen. Were there any other comments or questions before we close for the day? I know this is a really rich conversation topic, and I just want to thank you all for being here, for coming to see what we're doing and learn about it. And we will be incorporating these learnings into the learning journey that's happening, into the Earth Regeneration Fund, and to the other activities that are happening in our different bioregions. So I hope that today is inspiring and informative for those future conversations. So with that, thank you all very much for being here, and I look forward to more.